Hey guys, today we're stepping into a world that could feel strangely familiar and completely distant at the same time. A world of crowded markets, strict family duties, long roads, shared meals, and careful rituals. When most people think of ancient China, they picture emperors, armies, walls, and dynasties. But the real story of the civilization was lived somewhere quieter, in kitchens, workshops, courtyards, farms, and narrow city streets. And once you begin looking closely at ordinary life, you start to see how one of the world's longest-lasting civilizations was held together, not only by rulers and laws, but by routine. And before we settle into the story, if you enjoy calm, thoughtful history like this, consider subscribing. A lot of people who return to these long-form documentaries do so because they want history that is steady, clear, and worth spending time with. And subscribing is a simple way to make sure you don't miss the next deep dive. To understand ancient Chinese daily life, it helps to begin with a simple truth. There was never just one ancient China. The civilization lasted for thousands of years, across many dynasties, climates, landscapes, and social changes. Life in the Shang period was not the same as life in the Han. Life in the Tang capital was not the same as life in a farming village in the far south. But across those long centuries, some patterns remained remarkably stable. The family was the center of life. Agriculture was the base of the economy. Respect for hierarchy shaped behavior. Education carried prestige. Ritual gave meaning to ordinary actions, and the state, whether strong or weak, reached into daily existence through taxes, labor, law, and custom. For most people, daily life began not in palaces but in the countryside. Ancient China was overwhelmingly rural for much of its history, and the typical person was a farmer. Their days were guided by the agricultural calendar more than by anything else. The seasons determined work, food, income, and anxiety. In the north, where wheat and millet were common, the climate and soil produced one rhythm of labor. In the wetter south, rice cultivation created another with its own intense demands. Rice farming in particular required careful irrigation, coordinated timing, and exhausting manual effort. A failed harvest was not an abstract political problem. It meant hunger, debt, migration, or worse. So daily life for millions of people revolved around preparing fields, repairing tools, managing water, planting, weeding, harvesting, and storing grain against uncertain seasons. The ordinary farmhouse was practical rather than grand. Building materials depended on wealth and region. Poorer families often lived in homes of packed earth, timber, reeds, or thatch, while wealthier households might have tiled roofs, brick walls, and enclosed courtyards. Furniture was limited for many. Space was shared. Smoke, dust, tools, baskets, jars, and sleeping mats were part of the visual texture of domestic life. The house was not simply a shelter. It was also a workplace, storage space, and family center. Grain had to be protected, clothing had to be repaired, food had to be prepared, and ancestors had to be remembered. Even in modest homes, daily life carried moral meaning. Orderliness, thrift, obedience, and proper conduct were not only practical virtues. They were tied to larger ideas about a well-run family and a stable society. The family itself was rarely imagined in purely individual terms. In ancient China, identity was deeply relational. A person was a son, daughter, father, wife, elder brother, younger sister, or widow before being understood as a completely separate self. This did not mean everyone lived harmoniously. Family life could be affectionate, dutiful, stressful, and unequal all at once. But it did mean that household hierarchy was taken seriously. Age mattered, gender mattered, status within the family mattered. In many periods, especially under the growing influence of Confucian values, the ideal household was one where each member knew their role and fulfilled it correctly. Filial piety, meaning respect and duty toward parents and ancestors, was not treated as a sentimental preference. It was a moral foundation. That moral foundation shaped childhood from an early age. Children were expected to learn obedience, work habits, and ritual behavior. In farming families, children contributed as soon as they were able, fetching water, gathering fuel, watching animals, helping in fields, or assisting in craft work. Childhood existed, but it was not separated sharply from adult responsibility. Boys and girls both worked, though their roles often diverged more clearly as they grew older. Sons were especially valued in many times and places because they carried on the family line, performed ancestral rites, and could support parents in old age. Daughters were loved too, but often understood through the reality that they would likely marry into another household. Marriage was therefore not usually seen as a private romantic choice. It was a family arrangement with economic, social, and ritual significance. Matchmaking, negotiation, and attention to compatibility between households were common. Weddings joined not only two individuals but two family lines. A new bride entered the husband's household and was expected to adapt to its customs and authority structure. Her daily life could be shaped heavily by her relationship with her husband's parents, especially the mother-in-law. In elite writings, the ideal woman was often described as diligent, modest, disciplined, and devoted to family harmony. Real women, of course, lived more complex lives than ideals suggest. They managed households, raised children, worked in textile production, participated in market exchange, and in some periods wielded considerable influence inside family networks. But the formal social order remained strongly patriarchal. Food sat at the center of everyday experience, and it revealed both regional variety and social difference. What people ate depended on class, location, and season. Common farmers might live largely on millet gruel in the north or rice in the south, supported by vegetables, beans, and occasionally small amounts of meat or fish when available. Wealthier families had access to more varied diets, finer grain, better seasoning, preserved foods, and larger kitchens. Soy products, including early forms of bean curd and fermented pastes, became important over time. Tea gradually rose from a regional product to a major cultural habit, especially in later ancient periods. Meals were not simply nutritional events. They expressed family order, hospitality, and status. Who sat where, who served whom, and what was offered to guests all carried social meaning. Clothing also communicated far more than comfort. In ancient China, dress reflected class, occupation, region, and rank. Commoners wore simple garments made of hemp, ramie, or coarse cloth, while elites might wear fine silk. The production of textiles, especially spinning and weaving, was one of the central forms of labor within many households, and women's work in this area was economically essential. Silk was especially significant, not just as a luxury fabric, but as a symbol of refinement and a valuable economic resource. The state sometimes taxed cloth and textile labor tied domestic life to larger systems of trade and government. To get dressed in the morning in ancient China was, in a quiet way, to step into a visible social order. Beyond the village, towns and cities offered another kind of daily life. Urban centers could be noisy, regulated, and surprisingly sophisticated. Markets sold grain, tools, pottery, herbs, paper, cloth, animals, and cooked food. Artisans made lacquerware, ceramics, metal goods, musical instruments, and household objects. Carpenters, blacksmiths, scribes, physicians, and merchants all played their part. In large capitals especially, the scale of organization could be remarkable. Streets were planned, wards could be controlled, gates were opened and closed, and officials monitored movement and commerce. A city was not merely a place of trade. It was also a place where the state became visible. Notices, taxes, patrols, courts, granaries, and official compounds reminded urban residents that authority was never far away. Even so, the city was also where culture flourished most visibly. Entertainment took many forms depending on the era: music, storytelling, festivals, religious ceremonies, acrobatics, board games, drinking houses, literary gatherings, and public celebrations. People visited temples, attended seasonal events, watched processions, and exchanged gossip in streets and tea shops. The ancient Chinese world was not silent and solemn all the time. It was busy with sound, smell, and movement. Vendors called out goods. Animals passed through lanes. Bells marked ritual space. Workshops echoed with labor. Smoke rose from kitchens and furnaces. Daily life had texture, and much of it was communal. For the educated elite, however, one feature of daily life stood above many others: study. Literacy was never universal, but writing had extraordinary prestige. The Chinese script linked administration, scholarship, ritual, and memory. To learn characters was to enter a demanding intellectual tradition. Boys from wealthier or ambitious families might spend long hours memorizing classical texts, practicing calligraphy, and learning moral teachings. Education promised more than knowledge. At its highest level, it offered a path into official life. Over time, especially as examination culture matured, the disciplined scholar became one of the most admired social types in Chinese civilization. His daily routine of copying texts, reciting passages, composing essays, and cultivating manners was seen as preparation not only for employment, but for moral usefulness. Beyond the household and the fields, ancient Chinese daily life was also shaped by the quiet presence of belief, ritual, and tradition. These practices were not always dramatic or public. Many of them were small actions repeated regularly across generations. Lighting incense, maintaining a family shrine, remembering ancestors on particular days of the year, or observing seasonal festivals were ways that ordinary people connected their present lives with the past. Ancestor veneration was especially important. Families believed that those who had lived before them continued to influence the living world. Showing respect through offerings and remembrance was not simply symbolic. It was thought to help maintain harmony between generations, even after death. Inside many homes, a small altar might hold wooden tablets inscribed with the names of deceased relatives. Food, tea, or wine could be placed before these tablets during special occasions. These rituals reinforced the idea that family lines stretched far beyond the current generation. A farmer repairing a fence, a mother preparing dinner, or a child learning to bow respectfully were all participating in a tradition that connected daily effort with a long chain of ancestors. In this way, daily life was never entirely separate from the spiritual world. Religion in ancient China was not always organized in the same way modern religions are. Instead, belief systems often blended together. Folk traditions, ancestor worship, Taoist practices, and later Buddhist teachings could all coexist in the same community. A village might have a shrine to a local spirit, a temple dedicated to a protective deity, and a traveling monk offering teachings from Buddhist scriptures. People often approached religion in practical terms. They prayed for rain during droughts, for health during illness, or for good fortune before journeys and business ventures. Religion, like farming or family duty, was part of the rhythm of ordinary existence. Seasonal festivals added moments of celebration to what could otherwise be a demanding life. These festivals were tied to the agricultural calendar and to ancient traditions that had developed over centuries. One of the most important was the Lunar New Year, a time when families cleaned their homes, settled debts if possible, and prepared food for gatherings. The festival was not only about celebration. It symbolized renewal, the closing of one cycle and the careful beginning of another. Firecrackers, lanterns, music, and shared meals brought villages and neighborhoods together, reminding people that community life mattered just as much as individual effort. Another well-known celebration was the Mid-Autumn Festival, when families gathered to admire the full moon and share special foods, including early forms of what we now recognize as mooncakes. In ancient times, the full moon was associated with reunion and reflection. Looking up at the same moon reminded people of family members who might be traveling or living far away. For a civilization spread across vast distances, these moments carried emotional weight. Even while festivals offered relief and joy, daily life still demanded constant work. Craft production was an essential part of the economy, and many households combined farming with specialized skills. In one village, a family might focus on pottery. In another, metal tools or wooden furniture might be produced. Some regions became famous for particular crafts that were traded across long distances. Chinese ceramics, for example, became widely admired for their quality and design. Workshops produced bowls, jars, plates, and ritual vessels, many of which traveled through trade networks that stretched across Asia. Silk production was another remarkable example of specialized labor woven into everyday life. The process began with the careful raising of silkworms, which fed exclusively on mulberry leaves. Families had to monitor the insects closely, protecting them from temperature changes and disease. Once the silkworms spun their cocoons, workers unwound the delicate threads and wove them into fabric. The work required patience and precision. Silk was not only beautiful, it was valuable enough to become a major trade commodity and even a form of tax payment in certain periods. The famous Silk Road, which connected China with Central Asia and beyond, owed much of its existence to this fragile thread produced in quiet village homes. Transportation and travel also played a role in shaping daily life, though many people rarely journeyed far from their birthplace. Roads connected villages, towns, and imperial capitals, allowing merchants, officials, soldiers, and messengers to move across the landscape. Traveling merchants brought new goods and stories into rural communities. Caravans moved valuable items such as silk, tea, jade, and spices between distant regions. For the average villager, the arrival of traders might be one of the few opportunities to see foreign products or hear news from faraway places. Yet travel could also be difficult and dangerous. Roads were not always smooth or well-maintained, and banditry sometimes threatened travelers. River transport often offered a safer alternative, and China's extensive network of waterways became one of the great logistical advantages of the civilization. Boats carried grain, timber, ceramics, and other goods through canals and rivers that linked interior regions with major cities. The Grand Canal, begun in ancient times and expanded later, became one of the most impressive engineering achievements in world history, allowing enormous quantities of grain to be transported from southern farms to northern capitals. Despite these connections, the rhythms of everyday life remained local for most people. A farmer's concerns were usually immediate: the health of crops, the strength of the family, the demands of taxes, and the uncertainty of weather. Government officials appeared occasionally to collect grain taxes, enforce laws, or organized labor projects such as road repair or irrigation work. These interactions reminded villagers that they were part of a larger empire, even if imperial politics felt distant. In this way, ancient Chinese daily life balanced two powerful forces. On one hand, life was deeply rooted in local families, villages, and traditions that changed slowly over generations. On the other hand, the state, trade networks, and cultural ideas linked those small communities into one of the most enduring civilizations in human history. And it was within this balance between local routine and imperial structure that ordinary people lived out their days. Work, however, was only one part of daily existence. Just as important were the systems of law and administration that quietly organized life across the empire. Ancient China developed one of the most sophisticated bureaucratic systems of the ancient world, and even people living in distant villages felt its influence. Officials appointed by the state were responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, overseeing labor obligations, and ensuring that imperial policies reached the local level. These officials were often educated men who had spent years studying classical texts and moral philosophy. In theory, they were expected to govern with fairness, discipline, and a strong sense of ethical responsibility. For ordinary people, the presence of government might be felt most clearly during tax season. Taxes could be collected in grain, cloth, labor service, or other goods depending on the dynasty and local policies. Farmers were expected to contribute a portion of their harvest, which helped support the imperial court, the military, and the administrative system. While the tax burden varied throughout history, it could become heavy during times of war, disaster, or political instability. A poor harvest combined with tax demands could place enormous strain on rural households. When these pressures became too great, they sometimes led to migration, banditry, or even rebellion. Legal codes also shaped everyday behavior. Ancient Chinese law was detailed and often strict, covering crimes ranging from theft and violence to administrative corruption. The law was not designed simply to punish wrongdoing. It was also meant to reinforce social order. Punishments could include fines, forced labor, exile, or corporal penalties depending on the severity of the offense. At the same time, officials were expected to consider circumstances carefully, and local magistrates often played the role of both judge and mediator. Many disputes were settled through negotiation and community pressure rather than formal punishment. Health and medicine formed another quiet but important dimension of daily life. Ancient Chinese medical knowledge developed gradually through observation, experience, and philosophical ideas about the balance of the body. Physicians believed that health depended on harmony between internal forces often described as yin and yang, as well as the smooth flow of vital energy through the body. Treatments could include herbal remedies, dietary adjustments, acupuncture, massage, and careful lifestyle changes. While these methods differed from modern medical science, they reflected a serious attempt to understand the body as part of a larger natural system. For ordinary families, illness was always a serious concern. Without modern sanitation or advanced treatments, even common diseases could become life-threatening. Parents worried about childhood illnesses, injuries from farm work, and the spread of seasonal sicknesses. Herbal medicine and traditional healing knowledge were therefore valued skills in many communities. Older family members often passed down practical remedies using plants, roots, and minerals gathered from the surrounding landscape. Education, though not accessible to everyone, remained one of the most respected paths within society. In wealthier households or families with scholarly ambitions, boys might begin learning characters at a young age. The process was demanding. Chinese writing required memorizing thousands of symbols, each with its own meaning and pronunciation. Students practiced by copying texts repeatedly with brush and ink, developing both literacy and the graceful art of calligraphy. Education emphasized not only knowledge but also moral discipline. Classical texts taught ideals such as loyalty, respect, honesty, and proper conduct. For the small number of students who advanced far enough, success in the imperial examination system could transform their lives. Passing these rigorous exams opened the door to government service, social prestige, and economic stability. Preparing for the examinations required years of study, often under the guidance of teachers or tutors. Many young men spent long days reading ancient philosophical works, writing essays, and memorizing passages from the Confucian classics. Their families invested enormous hope in this effort, knowing that even one successful scholar could elevate the status of an entire household. While scholars pursued education and farmers worked the land, soldiers represented another part of the social landscape. Military service varied depending on the dynasty. Some periods relied on conscription, requiring men from farming families to serve in the army for certain periods of time. Other dynasties maintained professional soldiers stationed along borders or in strategic regions. For those who served, daily life involved training, discipline, patrol duties, and sometimes long campaigns far from home. The army played a critical role in protecting trade routes, defending borders, and maintaining internal stability. Yet even soldiers remained connected to the same social values that shaped civilian life. Loyalty to family and respect for authority remained important virtues. Letters sent home, when possible, reminded soldiers of the villages and families waiting for their return. Military life could be harsh, but it was also understood as a form of service to the larger order of the empire. As evening approached in a typical village, daily rhythms gradually slowed. Farmers returned from the fields carrying tools worn from hours of labor. Smoke rose from cooking fires as families prepared simple meals. Conversations unfolded quietly in courtyards and small lanes. Children might finish small chores before settling near their parents or grandparents, listening to stories passed down through generations. These stories sometimes included legends of ancient rulers, tales of clever scholars, or moral lessons about virtue and wisdom. Nightfall brought darkness in a world without electric light. Oil lamps or candles provided limited illumination, encouraging people to rest earlier than modern schedules might allow. Sleep itself was a necessary preparation for the next day's work, because the routines of ancient life rarely allowed long periods of idleness. With sunrise would come the familiar cycle once again. Tending animals, preparing food, managing household tasks, and stepping back into the steady rhythm of labor that sustained the entire civilization. And when we step back from these quiet scenes, something remarkable becomes clear. The vast dynasties, imperial courts, and famous historical figures that fill history books were supported by millions of ordinary days lived by ordinary people. The farmer planting rice, the mother weaving cloth, the student practicing characters, the merchant arranging goods in a crowded market. All of them contributed to the long continuity of Chinese civilization. Their lives may not have been recorded in official histories, but they formed the true foundation upon which that history was built. As the centuries passed, the routines of daily life in ancient China slowly evolved, but many of the underlying principles remained surprisingly consistent. Stability within the household, respect for hierarchy, and a close relationship with the rhythms of nature continued to guide everyday decisions. Even as dynasties rose and fell, ordinary families often experienced history in quieter ways. Political change might mean a new emperor, new tax rules, or different officials arriving in the local district, but the morning tasks of feeding animals, preparing meals, and tending fields continued much as they always had. Markets became one of the most lively centers of everyday activity, especially in growing towns and cities. These markets were not simply places to buy and sell goods. They were social hubs where news, rumors, and ideas circulated alongside baskets of vegetables and bundles of cloth. Farmers arrived with produce harvested at dawn, while craftsmen displayed tools, pottery, and metal goods created in small workshops. Street vendors sold cooked foods that filled the air with the smell of steamed dumplings, noodles, or roasted meats depending on the region. The market also provided a rare opportunity for people from different walks of life to interact. A traveling merchant from a distant province might speak with a local farmer. A scholar passing through town might purchase writing brushes or paper. Physicians sometimes set up temporary stalls offering herbal remedies or diagnostic advice. Even entertainers found space in these lively streets. Storytellers, musicians, and acrobats gathered crowds, offering brief moments of wonder in the middle of an otherwise practical day. Trade networks extended far beyond these local markets. Over time, Chinese merchants developed complex systems that moved goods across mountains, rivers, and deserts. Tea from southern hillsides, silk from specialized workshops, ceramics from famous kiln towns, and iron tools from regional foundries all traveled through these networks. While many villagers rarely left their hometowns, the objects they used often had long journeys behind them. A bowl on a farmer's table might have been fired in a kiln hundreds of miles away. Waterways played an especially important role in this movement. China's rivers acted as natural highways that allowed goods to travel efficiently across large distances. Boats carried grain from fertile southern regions toward northern population centers. Timber floated downstream for construction projects. Barges moved ceramics, textiles, and metal goods between trading hubs. Along busy riverbanks, docks and warehouses became small worlds of activity where laborers loaded cargo and merchants negotiated prices. Despite the growing complexity of trade, social order still emphasized agriculture as the most respected form of labor. In traditional Chinese thinking, farmers were seen as the foundation of the economy because they produced the food that sustained everyone else. Merchants, while sometimes wealthy, were often viewed with more suspicion because their profit came from trade rather than direct production. This attitude did not prevent commerce from expanding, but it did shape how different occupations were valued within society. Daily life also included moments of leisure, though these moments were usually modest compared with the long hours devoted to work. Games and simple entertainment offered relief from routine. Board games such as early forms of Go, known in Chinese as Weiqi, were played by scholars and commoners alike. The game required patience and strategic thinking, qualities admired in many areas of Chinese culture. Another popular pastime was kite flying, which was enjoyed by both children and adults during certain seasons when the wind was favorable. Music and poetry were also woven into everyday life, especially among educated circles. Scholars often believed that cultivating the arts helped refine the mind and character. Playing instruments such as the guqin, a quiet and elegant stringed instrument, was considered a sign of intellectual and moral discipline. Poetry gatherings allowed friends to share ideas and observations about nature, politics, and human life. These cultural activities were not merely hobbies. They reflected a broader belief that beauty, reflection, and emotional balance were important elements of a well-ordered life. For people living in rural communities, leisure often took the form of shared storytelling and communal gatherings. After long days of labor, neighbors might sit together in courtyards or near village wells, exchanging news and local legends. Stories about clever officials, wandering monks, mythical creatures, or famous historical heroes traveled easily through these conversations. In societies where written literacy was limited, oral storytelling became an important way of preserving memory and cultural identity. At the same time, natural forces constantly reminded people of their vulnerability. Floods, droughts, and harsh winters could disrupt the delicate balance of agricultural life. Rivers that supported trade and irrigation could also overflow, destroying crops and homes. In response, communities developed careful systems of water management, including canals, levees, and irrigation channels. Maintaining these systems often required collective labor organized by local officials or village leaders. These environmental challenges reinforced an ancient Chinese belief that harmony between humans and nature was essential for survival. Philosophical traditions such as Taoism encouraged people to observe natural patterns and avoid unnecessary conflict with the forces of the world. Even farmers who had never read philosophical texts understood this principle through experience. Success depended on timing, patience, and respect for the land. And so, day after day, generation after generation, the people of ancient China continued their routines. The rise of new dynasties might change banners in distant capitals, but the deeper patterns of life, family duty, agricultural labor, seasonal festivals, and community relationships remained steady threads running through the centuries. It was within these ordinary rhythms that one of the world's most enduring civilizations quietly sustained itself. Not through constant spectacle or dramatic events, but through millions of repeated actions. Planting seeds, teaching children, honoring ancestors, preparing meals, studying texts, repairing tools, and gathering again the next morning to begin the cycle once more. Over time, as cities expanded and dynasties strengthened their administrative reach, urban life in ancient China developed its own distinct rhythms. While villages were shaped by farming cycles, cities followed the movement of commerce, government activity, and social interaction. In larger capitals such as Chang'an during the Tang Dynasty or Luoyang during earlier periods, daily life unfolded within carefully organized districts. Streets were wide and structured, markets were regulated, and residential wards were sometimes enclosed by gates that opened at sunrise and closed at night. For city residents, the morning began with a gradual awakening of activity. Merchants prepared their stalls, craftsmen opened workshop doors, and officials traveled toward administrative compounds. The sounds of carts rolling across stone streets mixed with the voices of traders announcing their goods. Markets were filled with color and movement. Stalls displayed baskets of vegetables, cuts of meat, dried fish, bundles of herbs, and stacks of pottery. Silk fabrics hung in soft folds while metal tools and cooking utensils glinted in the sunlight. Artisans formed an important part of urban society. These skilled workers spent years mastering specific crafts that were essential to both local communities and long-distance trade. A bronze worker might shape ritual vessels or decorative objects. A carpenter could build furniture, doors, and architectural beams for expanding towns. Paper makers, whose craft became increasingly important after the invention of paper during the Han Dynasty, produced a material that would eventually transform communication and record-keeping across the world. Paper itself became a quiet revolution in everyday life. Before its widespread use, writing materials such as bamboo strips or silk were expensive and cumbersome. Paper allowed documents, letters, books, and official records to be produced more easily. Government offices depended heavily on written communication, and the spread of paper strengthened administrative efficiency. For scholars and students, paper also made the practice of writing and copying texts far more practical. Within city neighborhoods, family life remained central despite the busier environment. Houses in urban areas were often arranged around interior courtyards that provided light, air, and a sense of privacy. Even modest homes attempted to preserve this courtyard structure when space allowed. The courtyard served as a shared family space where children played, meals were prepared, and daily conversations unfolded. Plants, water jars, and small shrines might decorate the area, creating a calm center within the crowded surroundings of the city. Urban households often combined living space with work areas. A shopkeeper's family might live above or behind their store. A craftsman's workshop could occupy the front portion of the home while family members handled tools, materials, or sales. This blending of work and domestic life meant that children grew up observing the skills and responsibilities of their parents. Many trades were passed down through generations, creating strong traditions within particular families or neighborhoods. Food culture in cities also became more varied compared with rural villages. Markets and street vendors provided access to ingredients that might not be available in smaller communities. Noodle dishes, steamed buns, dumplings, and soups became common offerings in busy streets. Travelers passing through cities often described the lively food stalls where cooks prepared meals quickly for workers, merchants, and visitors. Eating outside the home was not unusual in these environments, especially for those who spent long hours conducting business in the marketplace. Tea houses gradually emerged as important social spaces as tea drinking spread across Chinese society. At first, tea had been valued mainly for medicinal purposes, but by later ancient periods it became a daily beverage enjoyed by people from many social classes. Tea houses offered a place where travelers could rest, scholars could discuss ideas, and merchants could negotiate deals. Conversation flowed easily in these settings, creating small pockets of community within large and sometimes impersonal cities. Entertainment also found its place within urban life. Public performances, storytelling, music, and theatrical displays attracted audiences eager for diversion after long days of work. Traveling performers might present acrobatics or puppet shows, while musicians played traditional instruments in small courtyards or gathering spaces. Storytellers held particular influence because they carried history, folklore, and moral lessons through spoken narratives. Their stories helped preserve cultural memory while entertaining listeners of all ages. Despite the energy of city life, the influence of tradition remained strong. Festivals, rituals, and family ceremonies continued to shape the calendar. During major holidays, city streets filled with lanterns, decorations, and crowds moving between markets and temples. These events temporarily transformed the normally regulated environment into a lively celebration of color, sound, and shared identity. Yet behind the visible excitement of urban centers stood the same foundation that supported all of ancient Chinese civilization: the steady work of countless individuals. Farmers supplying grain, artisans crafting goods, officials maintaining order, and families raising the next generation all contributed to a system that balanced local routine with imperial structure. When historians look back on ancient China, they often focus on emperors, wars, and monumental achievements like the Great Wall or vast canal systems. But those remarkable accomplishments depended on something quieter and more enduring. They depended on the ordinary patterns of daily life, people waking at dawn, performing their tasks with discipline, maintaining family traditions, and participating in the social networks that connected village, town, and empire. And in many ways, it is within these ordinary moments that the true character of ancient Chinese civilization becomes visible, not only in its grand achievements, but in the patient routines that allowed it to endure across centuries. As night settled over both village and city, the pace of life in ancient China gradually slowed, but the routines of the household continued in quieter ways. Evening was often the time when families gathered most closely together. After the long hours of work in fields, markets, or workshops, members of the household shared meals and conversation. These moments were simple but important. In many homes, the evening meal was the one time of day when everyone could sit together, reflecting the strong cultural emphasis on family unity. Meals were typically served in shared dishes placed at the center of the table. People used chopsticks, a practice that had become widespread centuries earlier. The act of eating together carried meaning beyond nutrition. It reinforced respect between generations and reminded each person of their place within the household structure. Elders were often served first, and younger members observed the behavior of their parents and grandparents, quietly learning the expectations that shaped social life. After dinner, many families spent time completing smaller tasks that could be done indoors. Clothing might be repaired by lamplight, tools prepared for the following day, or food preserved for later use. Women often continued spinning thread or weaving cloth, especially in households involved in textile production. These tasks were repetitive but essential, contributing to the economic stability of the family. In agricultural communities, even the quiet hours of evening remained part of the broader cycle of labor. Storytelling also became part of nighttime culture. Without modern entertainment, stories served as a powerful way to pass time and share knowledge. Older relatives often told traditional tales drawn from local legends, historical events, or moral teachings. These stories could feature wise officials who solved difficult problems, loyal friends who demonstrated courage, or mythical creatures that carried symbolic meaning. Children listened carefully, absorbing lessons about honesty, loyalty, patience, and wisdom. Education sometimes continued into the evening as well, particularly in households that valued scholarship. A young student preparing for examinations might sit beside a small oil lamp, copying characters onto paper with a brush dipped in ink. The soft scratching sound of the brush moving across the page was a familiar presence in homes where education offered hope for social advancement. Memorization and repetition required patience, and the quiet hours of night provided the concentration needed for study. In cities, nightlife could remain slightly more active than in rural villages. Tea houses, small inns, and gathering places sometimes stayed open later, welcoming travelers and merchants who arrived after long journeys. Lantern light illuminated narrow streets, casting warm glows against wooden buildings and stone pathways. Although activity slowed, the city never became entirely silent. Guards patrolled certain districts, and distant conversations could still be heard drifting through open windows. Yet for most people, night was a time for rest. The lack of artificial lighting meant that sleep followed the natural rhythm of darkness. People often woke early with the sunrise, so adequate rest was necessary for the demanding work that awaited them. Beds were simple by modern standards, sometimes consisting of wooden frames or raised platforms covered with mats or blankets. In colder regions, heated brick beds known as kong were used to provide warmth during winter months. Seasonal changes influenced these nightly routines. During harsh winters, families spent more time indoors, gathering around small sources of heat and sharing stories while winds moved outside. During warmer months, courtyards and open spaces allowed people to enjoy cooler evening air. Children might play quietly while adults spoke about village matters or upcoming agricultural work. Over the course of many generations, these small nightly habits created a sense of continuity. A family in the Han Dynasty might have ended their day in ways that would feel familiar to a family living centuries later under the Tang or Song dynasties. The details changed slowly, but the underlying patterns remained recognizable. Work during daylight, family gathering in the evening, reflection and rest during the night. When historians attempt to understand ancient civilizations, they often rely on official records written by scholars or government officials. These documents describe policies, wars, and major events. Yet the deeper story of ancient China lies in the quiet routines that rarely appeared in official histories. The daily efforts of farmers tending rice paddies, artisans shaping pottery, mothers weaving cloth, teachers guiding students, and merchants traveling dusty roads formed the living foundation of the empire. Across thousands of years, these ordinary actions created a society that valued stability, learning, and family continuity. Dynasties rose and fell, borders shifted, and cities expanded or declined. But the steady rhythm of daily life, rooted in family responsibility, respect for tradition, and careful attention to the natural world, remained one of the strongest forces holding Chinese civilization together. And perhaps that is the most remarkable aspect of ancient Chinese daily life. It was not defined by extraordinary moments, but by countless ordinary ones repeated patiently across generations. Through those routines, an entire civilization endured, quietly shaping one of the longest continuous cultural histories the world has ever known. Over long stretches of time, these patterns of ordinary life quietly shaped the character of Chinese civilization. When people imagine the ancient world, they often picture dramatic events, armies marching across landscapes, emperors issuing powerful decrees, or massive construction projects rising from the earth. Yet, for the overwhelming majority of people living in ancient China, history did not arrive as spectacle. It arrived slowly, through subtle changes in the routines that governed daily existence. One of the most visible examples of this gradual change was technology. Many tools used in farming and household work improved over centuries. Iron plows replaced earlier wooden versions, making it easier to turn heavy soil and increase agricultural productivity. Improved irrigation systems allowed farmers to guide water more effectively across fields, especially in rice-growing regions where precise water control was essential. These changes might not have seemed dramatic to the farmers themselves, but they steadily increased food production and supported larger populations. Agricultural innovation also encouraged the growth of villages and towns. As harvests became more reliable, communities were able to sustain more specialized occupations. Instead of every family focusing entirely on farming, some individuals devoted themselves to crafts such as pottery, carpentry, or metalworking. This gradual diversification of labor helped strengthen local economies and created the foundations for more complex urban centers. In many communities, cooperation between neighbors was necessary for survival. Large irrigation systems, flood barriers, and shared farming equipment required collective effort. Villagers often organized themselves to maintain canals, repair roads, or build storage facilities. These cooperative projects reinforced the importance of mutual responsibility. Even though each family worked its own fields, the success of the harvest often depended on the coordination of the entire community. Natural disasters could quickly disrupt this delicate balance. Floods along major rivers, such as the Yellow River, were especially feared. The river's unpredictable course sometimes shifted dramatically, destroying farmland and forcing entire communities to relocate. Droughts presented a different challenge, leaving crops unable to grow in parched soil. When disasters struck, local officials were expected to organize relief efforts, distribute grain from government granaries, and manage reconstruction. In theory, the emperor's responsibility was to ensure the well-being of the people, and natural disasters were sometimes interpreted as signs that the ruler had lost moral authority. This belief formed part of an important political idea known as the mandate of heaven. According to this concept, heaven granted the right to rule to emperors who governed wisely and justly. If rulers became corrupt or failed to protect their people, heaven could withdraw its support, allowing rebellion or the rise of a new dynasty. For ordinary people, this belief connected the hardships of daily life with the broader moral order of the universe. A poor harvest or destructive flood might be interpreted not only as a natural event but also as a reflection of political imbalance. Despite these challenges, communities continued to rebuild and adapt. Over generations, families developed deep knowledge of local landscapes. They understood which crops grew best in particular soils, how to prepare fields for changing seasons, and how to store food for difficult times. This practical knowledge was rarely written down but passed from one generation to the next through direct experience. The same process occurred in many forms of craftsmanship. A potter might teach a child how to shape clay on a wheel, explaining how temperature and timing affected the strength of the finished vessel. A carpenter could show an apprentice how to join wooden beams without nails, using carefully carved joints that held structures together for decades. These skills required patience and careful observation. Mastery came slowly, often after years of practice. Cultural traditions also traveled through families and communities in similar ways. Festivals, songs, proverbs, and rituals were learned through participation rather than formal instruction. A child observing elders prepare offerings during a festival gradually absorbed the meaning behind the gestures. Over time, these practices reinforced shared values about respect, gratitude, and harmony. Communication between distant regions of China also became more regular as transportation networks improved. Roads, canals, and river routes linked provinces that had once been relatively isolated. Travelers carried not only goods but also ideas. A merchant arriving from another region might introduce new cooking techniques, clothing styles, or tools. Buddhist monks traveling along trade routes shared religious teachings that gradually spread through many parts of Chinese society. As these ideas circulated, they blended with existing traditions. Buddhism, for example, did not simply replace earlier beliefs. Instead, it became integrated with local customs and philosophies such as Confucianism and Taoism. Temples, monasteries, and shrines appeared in towns and cities, offering spaces for reflection and prayer. For ordinary people, visiting a temple might involve lighting incense, making a small offering, or quietly asking for protection and good fortune. In this way, ancient Chinese daily life was shaped by a complex combination of tradition, adaptation, and quiet resilience. People worked within systems that had developed over centuries, yet they constantly adjusted those systems in response to changing conditions. Every planted field, repaired house, and shared meal represented a small act of continuity that connected the present with the past. And when we look back at this long history, we begin to understand something important. Civilizations are not sustained only by rulers or grand monuments. They are sustained by ordinary people who wake each morning, fulfill their responsibilities, care for their families, and participate in the traditions that give their lives meaning. In ancient China, millions of such lives unfolded day after day. Their routines may seem humble when compared to the dramatic events recorded in historical chronicles. Yet it was precisely these quiet routines, the planting of crops, the teaching of children, the honoring of ancestors, and the steady pursuit of harmony, that allowed one of the world's oldest civilizations to endure across thousands of years. As we continue looking closer at daily life in ancient China, another important part of ordinary experience was the relationship between people and knowledge. Knowledge was not limited to scholars preparing for government service. Practical knowledge, how to grow crops, build homes, heal illness, prepare food, and navigate seasonal change, was valued in nearly every household. While official histories often highlight philosophers and famous thinkers, the survival of everyday communities depended on knowledge that was learned through observation and repetition. Farmers, for instance, relied on careful understanding of the land. They observed the behavior of rivers, the direction of seasonal winds, and the timing of rainfall. Planting too early or too late could mean the difference between abundance and scarcity. Over generations, farmers developed methods that balanced productivity with sustainability. Crop rotation, irrigation channels, and terraced fields on hillsides were all ways of adapting to the environment. These methods were rarely written down in formal texts. Instead, they were shared through demonstration, passed from parents to children as part of daily work. Household management also required skill and planning. Food had to be stored carefully so that supplies lasted through winter months or periods of poor harvest. Grains were dried and kept in sealed containers to prevent pests. Vegetables might be preserved through fermentation or pickling. Salt played an important role in preserving fish and meat when it was available. These preservation techniques allowed families to maintain a steady food supply even when fresh ingredients were limited. Clothing production represented another essential household activity. Before large-scale manufacturing existed, most clothing was produced within homes or small workshops. The process began with preparing fibers such as hemp or silk. These fibers were spun into thread and woven into cloth using simple looms. The finished fabric was then cut and sewn into garments. The entire process demanded patience and careful coordination, especially in households responsible for producing textiles as part of their economic livelihood. Children often participated in these tasks from a young age. Learning practical skills was considered a natural part of growing up. Boys might assist in agricultural work, learning how to guide animals, carry tools, or manage irrigation channels. Girls frequently learned textile production, cooking, and household organization from mothers and older relatives. Although the division of labor followed traditional gender roles, both boys and girls contributed meaningfully to the functioning of the family. Education, however, remained one of the few pathways that could dramatically alter a person's future. Families who hoped their sons might enter government service placed enormous importance on scholarly training. The Confucian classics became the foundation of this education. These texts taught principles about ethical behavior, loyalty, proper relationships, and the responsibilities of leadership. Students memorized passages and practiced writing essays that demonstrated their understanding of moral philosophy. Preparation for examinations could dominate a young scholar's daily routine. Hours were spent reading and copying texts with brush and ink, carefully forming each character. Calligraphy itself was considered both a technical skill and a reflection of character. A well-balanced brushstroke suggested discipline and focus, while careless writing might imply a lack of seriousness. Because the examination system offered one of the few routes to official positions, many families invested years of effort into supporting a student's education. Meanwhile, outside scholarly circles, commerce continued to connect communities across the empire. Traveling merchants were often familiar figures along roads and river routes. They carried goods such as tea, silk, ceramics, spices, medicinal herbs, and metal tools between different regions. The arrival of merchants brought excitement to small towns where new products and unfamiliar stories appeared. These merchants also played an important role in spreading ideas. A trader traveling between provinces might share news about distant cities, recent political events, or unusual customs from other parts of the empire. In this way, information slowly circulated through the same networks that transported physical goods. Even people who rarely traveled could learn about distant places through these conversations. Markets therefore functioned as centers not only of trade but also of communication. People gathered to exchange information, discuss local concerns, and observe the activities of others. News about harvest conditions, tax changes, or regional conflicts often spread through these gatherings. Markets allowed individuals from different occupations, farmers, artisans, officials, and merchants, to interact in ways that rarely occurred within the more structured environment of family life. Through all of these interactions, social values continued to emphasize harmony and balance. Confucian teachings encouraged individuals to act with respect toward elders, loyalty toward rulers, and kindness toward neighbors. While real life often included disagreements and conflict, the ideal of maintaining social harmony remained influential. Communities relied on cooperation, and maintaining good relationships with neighbors could be as important as fulfilling formal obligations to the state. Looking at these countless small routines, the planting of fields, the weaving of cloth, the study of classical texts, and the conversations in crowded markets, we begin to see how daily life quietly sustained the enormous structure of ancient Chinese civilization. The empire's strength did not rest solely on its rulers or armies. It rested on millions of individuals performing ordinary tasks with patience and dedication. And in many ways, these routines created a rhythm that lasted for centuries. Dynasties changed, borders shifted, and new ideas entered the cultural landscape. Yet the daily patterns of family life, agricultural labor, and community cooperation continued to provide stability. Through these steady habits, ancient China maintained a civilization that would influence the world for thousands of years. Another important aspect of daily life in ancient China was the relationship between people and the natural landscape that surrounded them. Unlike modern societies where nature is often separated from urban life, most ancient Chinese communities existed in close contact with fields, rivers, forests, and mountains. The environment was not simply a background to human activity. It shaped nearly every decision people made. Farmers observed subtle changes in weather patterns and seasonal signals. The blooming of certain plants, the behavior of insects, or the arrival of migrating birds could all signal the right moment for planting or harvesting. This careful observation of nature gradually formed a body of agricultural knowledge that guided communities for generations. Ancient Chinese calendars were closely tied to these natural cycles, dividing the year into seasonal markers that helped farmers organize their work. Water management was especially critical. Rivers provided fertile soil and irrigation, but they could also bring destruction. Communities built canals, levees, and irrigation systems to control the movement of water as much as possible. These projects often required the cooperation of many families working together. Repairing a canal or reinforcing a riverbank might involve entire villages contributing labor over several days. In this way, environmental management became a shared responsibility that strengthened community bonds. Mountains and forests also played important roles in daily life. They provided wood for building homes, fuel for cooking fires, and herbs used in traditional medicine. Hunters sometimes ventured into forested areas in search of wild animals, though this activity was usually secondary to farming. Certain mountains were considered sacred spaces where temples or shrines were built. Pilgrims traveled to these locations seeking spiritual reflection or blessings for their families. Philosophical traditions encouraged people to view nature with respect rather than domination. Taoist teachings in particular emphasized living in harmony with natural forces. According to these ideas, the best way to achieve balance in life was not through forceful control but through careful alignment with the rhythms of the world. While not every farmer studied Taoist philosophy directly, the underlying attitude toward nature, patience, observation, and adaptability was widely shared. Daily life also included moments of reflection that connected people with these broader ideas about balance. Scholars often wrote poetry describing landscapes, rivers, or quiet villages. These poems were not only artistic expressions. They reflected a belief that observing nature could reveal deeper truths about human life. Even people who could not read poetry might experience similar reflections while walking along riverbanks or watching the changing colors of fields through the seasons. As generations passed, these relationships between people, land, and tradition created strong attachments to particular places. Families often remained in the same village for many generations, cultivating the same fields and maintaining the same ancestral homes. Local landmarks, an old tree, a bend in the river, a hill overlooking the fields, became part of community identity. These familiar features formed the backdrop of childhood memories and family stories. Migration did occur at times, especially when wars, floods, or economic pressures forced people to seek new opportunities elsewhere. Yet even when families moved to distant regions, they often carried familiar customs with them. They rebuilt shrines, celebrated the same festivals, and taught children the same traditions they had known before. In this way, cultural continuity traveled alongside physical movement across the empire. Transportation networks gradually strengthened these connections between regions. Roads allowed officials, soldiers, and merchants to travel more efficiently, while river routes and canals moved goods in large quantities. The construction of major infrastructure projects required careful planning and enormous labor, but their impact on daily life was profound. Farmers in one region could sell surplus grain to distant cities, and urban craftsmen could receive raw materials from faraway provinces. Yet despite these growing connections, the fundamental experience of daily life remained rooted in local routines. A farmer still woke before sunrise to prepare tools and check the condition of the fields. A craft worker still focused patiently on shaping materials with practiced hands. A student still spent long hours memorizing classical passages in hopes of passing examinations. These personal routines, repeated across countless households, formed the quiet engine of the civilization. When historians examine ancient China, they often highlight its remarkable continuity across thousands of years. Dynasties rose and fell, but many cultural patterns endured. That continuity was not maintained by emperors alone. It was sustained by ordinary people who carried forward traditions through everyday actions, preparing meals, teaching children, honoring ancestors, and cooperating with neighbors. And perhaps this is the most revealing lesson hidden within ancient Chinese daily life. The strength of the civilization did not come only from grand achievements like monumental architecture or powerful armies. It came from stability in the ordinary routines that shaped human experience. Through patience, discipline, and respect for tradition, millions of individuals created a society capable of enduring immense stretches of time. In the quiet repetition of those routines, planting fields, weaving cloth, studying texts, and sharing evening meals, the foundation of ancient China was built and rebuilt again each day as we look across the long timeline of ancient Chinese civilization. One final aspect of daily life becomes especially clear: the importance of continuity between generations. In many ancient societies, the idea of the family extended far beyond parents and children. It included grandparents, ancestors, and future descendants who had not yet been born. Life was understood as part of a long chain, where each generation inherited responsibilities from the past and passed them forward to the future. This perspective influenced many small choices people made every day. Maintaining family land was not only about present survival. It was also about preserving a resource that ancestors had worked to cultivate. Teaching children proper behavior was not simply about discipline. It ensured that traditions and values would continue long after the current generation was gone. Even simple rituals, such as honoring ancestors during seasonal festivals, reminded families that their lives were connected to a much larger historical story. Genealogy became an important way of preserving these connections. Many families kept records of their lineage, documenting the names of relatives across generations. These family histories strengthened identity and helped individuals understand their place within the broader structure of society. In some villages, ancestral halls were built where tablets bearing the names of past family members were kept. These halls served as gathering spaces during ceremonies and celebrations, reinforcing the sense that family unity extended across time. Daily respect for elders also reflected this generational mindset. Older family members were often seen as guardians of knowledge and tradition. Their experiences with farming, household management, and community relationships provided guidance for younger relatives. Listening to elders was therefore considered both practical and morally correct. The wisdom of age was valued because it helped maintain stability within the family and the village. Children grew up surrounded by these expectations. From a young age, they learned that personal behavior reflected not only on themselves but also on the reputation of their entire family. Courtesy, obedience, and responsibility were encouraged because they contributed to harmony within the household. While modern societies often emphasize individual independence, ancient Chinese culture tended to emphasize interconnected roles within a shared social structure. Marriage reinforced this continuity between generations. When a new couple formed a household, they were expected to contribute to the ongoing life of the family, producing children, caring for aging parents, and maintaining family traditions were central responsibilities. Weddings, therefore, carried meaning beyond personal celebration. They represented the renewal of the family line and the continuation of social stability. Communities also played a role in supporting these family structures. Neighbors often knew each other well and participated in shared activities throughout the year. Village meetings, seasonal festivals, and cooperative labor projects brought people together regularly. These interactions helped maintain trust and mutual support. If a household faced hardship due to illness or crop failure, neighbors might offer assistance, knowing that they might one day need similar help. At the same time, the broader political system connected these small communities to the larger empire. Imperial policies, tax systems, and infrastructure projects shaped the environment in which villages operated. Even though the emperor might live far away in a distant capital, his authority was symbolically present through local officials, written laws, and government institutions. Yet the remarkable feature of ancient Chinese civilization is that these vast imperial structures depended heavily on the stability of ordinary communities. The empire could only function if families continued to farm the land, raise children, and maintain social order at the local level. In other words, the strength of the entire system rested on the quiet routines of everyday life. When we imagine ancient China, it is tempting to focus on famous dynasties, powerful emperors, or monumental achievements like vast walls and canals. Those accomplishments were certainly impressive, but they represent only one layer of the historical picture. Beneath them existed the lives of millions of ordinary people whose names were rarely recorded. These individuals woke each morning to familiar tasks: preparing food, tending animals, working fields, practicing crafts, studying texts, or traveling to markets. Their days were shaped by seasonal cycles, family responsibilities, and community traditions. They celebrated festivals, faced hardships, raised children, and passed on knowledge learned from their parents. Over centuries, these repeated patterns created a powerful cultural continuity. Even as political systems changed and new ideas entered society, the underlying structure of daily life remained remarkably resilient. Families still gathered for shared meals. Farmers still observed the changing seasons. Students still memorized classical teachings in the hope of improving their futures. In this way, the true story of ancient Chinese daily life is not one of dramatic events but of enduring rhythms. It is a story of patience, responsibility, and cooperation across generations. The great civilization that historians study today was not built only in royal courts or military campaigns. It was built in kitchens, fields, workshops, courtyards, and classrooms, places where ordinary people carried out the quiet work of living. And through that quiet work, repeated day after day for thousands of years, ancient China created one of the most stable and influential cultural traditions in human history. As we reach the later reflections on ancient Chinese daily life, it becomes clear that time itself was experienced differently than it is in many modern societies. Life moved at a slower, more cyclical pace. The rising and setting of the sun, the arrival of rain, the ripening of crops, and the turning of the seasons were the true clocks that structured human activity. Without modern technologies that compress time and distance, people experienced the passing of days and years through natural rhythms that had guided communities for centuries. Morning, for example, was not simply the beginning of work. It was the renewal of a cycle that had repeated countless times before. Farmers stepping into their fields at dawn might be walking along paths that their grandparents and great-grandparents had walked. The same irrigation channels carried water across the land. The same hills framed the horizon, and the same seasonal tasks returned year after year. This repetition created a sense of continuity that anchored communities through generations. In rural areas, the agricultural calendar shaped nearly every aspect of planning. Early spring brought the preparation of fields and careful planting. Summer demanded constant attention to growing crops, irrigation systems, and the removal of weeds. Autumn was the most important season for harvest, when the success or failure of the year became clear. Winter, while quieter in terms of farming, still involved repairing tools, preparing equipment, weaving textiles, and maintaining homes for the coming year. Even festivals followed this seasonal rhythm. Many celebrations were timed according to the lunar calendar, linking human gatherings to celestial patterns. Lanterns illuminated streets during winter festivals, while spring celebrations welcomed the return of warmer weather. These events offered not only entertainment but also reassurance that life continued within a stable cycle shared by the entire community. For many people, time was also measured through family milestones. Births, marriages, and funerals marked the passage of life within the household. Each event carried ceremonial traditions that reminded individuals of their responsibilities within the family structure. When a child was born, relatives gathered to celebrate and offer blessings for a healthy future. When a marriage occurred, two family lines joined together, strengthening social networks within the community. When an elder passed away, careful mourning rituals honored the life that had contributed to the family's history. These life events were treated with seriousness because they connected personal experience with cultural values. Respect for ancestors ensured that the past remained present in everyday thought. The memory of previous generations guided decisions about how to live honorably and maintain family reputation. Through rituals and shared remembrance, individuals understood themselves as part of a long historical chain. At the same time, communities were not isolated from change. New tools, crops, and ideas slowly entered Chinese society through trade and cultural exchange. Over centuries, crops such as new varieties of rice improved agricultural productivity. Technological innovations like improved plows or water-powered machinery made certain tasks more efficient. These changes did not appear suddenly but gradually altered the daily routines of farmers and craftsmen. Urban centers also evolved as trade expanded. Markets became larger and more organized, attracting merchants from distant regions. Some cities grew into major cultural centers where scholars, artists, and officials interacted regularly. In these environments, daily life included intellectual debates, artistic creation, and the exchange of philosophical ideas. While rural villages remained deeply tied to agriculture, cities became places where culture and commerce flourished together. Despite these differences between rural and urban life, the underlying values of Chinese society remained consistent. Harmony, respect, and balance were guiding principles that influence behavior at every level of society. Confucian teachings encouraged individuals to cultivate virtue through disciplined habits and thoughtful conduct. Taoist ideas reminded people to observe the natural world and avoid unnecessary conflict with its rhythms. Buddhist traditions introduced reflections on compassion, suffering, and spiritual enlightenment. These philosophical traditions did not remain confined to scholars or monks. Their influence gradually shaped everyday attitudes about morality and personal responsibility. A farmer showing kindness to a neighbor, a merchant conducting fair trade, or a student practicing patience during study could all be seen as living expressions of these larger philosophical ideals. When we step back and observe the complete picture of ancient Chinese daily life, we begin to see a civilization built not on constant upheaval but on remarkable stability. Millions of individuals carried out similar routines across vast distances and long periods of time. Their actions were guided by traditions that valued order, cooperation, and respect for both family and nature. The great monuments and imperial achievements of Chinese history were certainly impressive, but they rested upon this deeper foundation of ordinary life. Without the steady labor of farmers producing food, artisans crafting tools, teachers educating students, and families preserving cultural traditions, the empire itself could not have endured. And so, the story of ancient Chinese daily life is ultimately a story about continuity. It is the story of countless mornings beginning with familiar tasks, countless evenings ending with shared meals and quiet conversation, and countless generations passing knowledge forward to those who came after them. Through these repeated moments, simple, patient, and often unrecorded, an entire civilization maintained its identity across thousands of years. In the quiet rhythm of those ordinary days, ancient China found the strength to endure. As we draw even closer to the human side of ancient Chinese life, it helps to imagine what people felt about the future. For many ordinary individuals, the future was not thought of in terms of personal ambition alone, but in terms of stability. Stability for the household, stability for the village, and stability for the generations that would follow. A good life was often measured not by dramatic success, but by whether a family remained secure, respected, and able to pass its traditions forward. Parents devoted much of their energy to preparing children for this responsibility. Teaching did not always happen in formal lessons. Much of it occurred through example. A child watching a parent carefully repair a farming tool was learning patience and responsibility. A daughter helping prepare food for a festival was learning the rituals that maintained family identity. A son accompanying his father to the fields was learning the quiet discipline required to manage land successfully. Over time, these lessons created a sense of belonging that connected individuals to their communities. A person was rarely defined only by personal choices. Instead, identity grew out of relationships with parents, siblings, neighbors, teachers, and ancestors. These relationships formed a network of mutual expectations that guided behavior in everyday situations. Village life reflected this network clearly. Neighbors often depended on one another in practical ways. If a family needed help repairing a roof after a storm, nearby households might contribute labor. During busy planting or harvesting seasons, cooperation ensured that fields were managed efficiently before weather conditions changed. These moments of cooperation strengthened trust, which was essential for maintaining peace within small communities where people interacted constantly. Public spaces in villages also played a role in shaping daily interaction. Wells, small shrines, open courtyards, and local markets became places where people met regularly. Conversations about crops, weather, family matters, or regional news often happened in these shared spaces. While the discussions might seem ordinary, they helped maintain a sense of collective awareness within the community. In cities, these social interactions took slightly different forms. Instead of gathering around fields or village wells, people met in marketplaces, tea houses, and busy streets. Urban neighborhoods could be crowded, but they also created opportunities for cultural exchange. Craftsmen shared techniques, merchants negotiated prices, and scholars debated philosophical ideas. The city became a place where different occupations and social classes crossed paths more frequently. Even with these differences, the underlying importance of social harmony remained strong. Conflicts did occur, as they do in any society, but maintaining order and respect was considered essential for community stability. Local elders or officials sometimes acted as mediators when disputes arose, encouraging compromise rather than prolonged conflict. This emphasis on mediation reflected the broader cultural preference for restoring balance rather than escalating disagreement. Art and craftsmanship also provided quiet satisfaction in everyday life. Skilled artisans often took pride in producing objects that combined practicality with beauty. A ceramic bowl, for example, was not merely a container for food. Its shape, texture, and glaze reflected careful attention to detail. Over generations, certain regions became known for distinctive artistic styles that were admired across the empire. Similarly, calligraphy transformed writing into an artistic practice. Scholars believed that the movement of the brush revealed the character of the writer. Calm, balanced strokes suggested inner discipline and clarity of thought. Even outside scholarly circles, the beauty of written characters was appreciated as part of cultural identity. Music added another dimension to daily experience. Instruments such as flutes, drums, and stringed instruments were played during festivals, ceremonies, and private gatherings. Music was believed to influence emotions and create harmony within the human spirit. Confucian teachings even suggested that a well-governed society could be recognized by the quality and balance of its music. Over long periods of time, these cultural expressions, art, music, literature, and craftsmanship, enriched everyday life beyond basic survival. They reminded people that civilization was not only about producing food or maintaining order. It was also about cultivating beauty, reflection, and emotional balance. When modern observers look back at ancient Chinese civilization, they sometimes focus on how advanced its political institutions or technological achievements were. Yet the deeper story lies in how people organized their daily lives in ways that encouraged long-term stability. Families taught children discipline and respect. Communities practiced cooperation and mutual support. Cultural traditions reinforced values that helped maintain harmony within society. These patterns did not eliminate hardship. Ancient life could be physically demanding and uncertain. Crop failures, illness, and political changes all created challenges. But the social structures developed over centuries provided tools for resilience. Shared traditions, strong family networks, and collective responsibility allowed communities to adapt and recover when difficulties arose. And so, when we imagine a typical evening somewhere in ancient China, a farmer resting after a day in the fields, a mother finishing her weaving by lamplight, children listening to the quiet stories of their elders, we are witnessing something more than a single household's routine. We are seeing the quiet foundation of a civilization that endured for thousands of years. Through ordinary moments repeated patiently across generations, ancient Chinese society created a rhythm of life strong enough to carry its culture, knowledge, and traditions forward through history as we continue exploring the quiet rhythms of ancient Chinese daily life. It becomes increasingly clear that one of the strongest forces holding society together was habit. Not habit in the casual sense, but deeply ingrained patterns of behavior that shaped how people moved through the world. These habits were built slowly across generations, reinforced by family teachings, cultural traditions, and the expectations of the community. Everyday etiquette was an important part of this structure. Even simple actions such as greeting someone, Entering a room or sharing a meal followed subtle rules that reflected respect and social order. Younger people were expected to show deference to elders, not only through words but through posture, tone, and behavior. Bowing slightly when greeting an older relative or speaking with measured politeness were ways of maintaining harmony within relationships. These gestures might seem small, but they carried deep meaning. In a society where cooperation and mutual dependence were essential, small acts of courtesy helped prevent conflict and preserve trust. When people followed these patterns of respect, daily interactions moved smoothly, reinforcing a shared understanding of proper conduct. Work itself was often viewed through a similar moral lens. Labor was not simply about producing food or goods. It was also considered a demonstration of character. Diligence, patience, and responsibility were praised qualities. Whether someone worked as a farmer, a craftsman, or a scholar, Confucian teachings often emphasized that fulfilling one's duties with care contributed to the well-being of the entire society. For farmers, this meant tending crops carefully and managing resources responsibly. For artisans, it meant perfecting techniques through years of practice. For scholars, it meant studying diligently and striving to govern wisely if they entered official service. Each role carried expectations that connected individual behavior to the stability of the larger community. In many villages, the rhythm of work and rest was closely synchronized among households. When planting season arrived, fields across the landscape filled with activity. Neighbors worked side by side, sometimes sharing tools or assisting families who needed extra help. During harvest time, entire communities focused their efforts on gathering crops before weather conditions changed. These shared moments of intense labor created a sense of collective accomplishment. After these demanding periods, festivals offered opportunities to celebrate and relax together. Lanterns illuminated village streets, food was prepared in abundance, and traditional performances brought laughter and music into public spaces. For children, these festivals were often the most memorable moments of the year. Bright colors, festive decorations, and the excitement of gathering with neighbors created lasting impressions that would later become cherished memories. In quieter seasons, the pace of life slowed again. Winter, especially in northern regions, brought colder temperatures that limited outdoor agricultural work. Families spent more time indoors, repairing tools, weaving cloth, and preparing supplies for the coming year. These months also allowed time for storytelling and reflection. Elders shared experiences from their own lives, offering advice shaped by years of observation. Such storytelling served a deeper purpose than entertainment. It transmitted values and practical wisdom to younger generations. Stories about honest officials, clever problem solvers, or loyal friends illustrated the virtues admired within society. By hearing these stories repeatedly, children gradually absorbed ideas about integrity, perseverance, and kindness. In cities where life moved slightly faster, similar values still shaped everyday behavior. Merchants who gained reputations for fairness attracted loyal customers. Craftsmen who maintained high standards were respected within their professions. Scholars who demonstrated humility and discipline earned admiration among their peers. Reputation mattered greatly because trust formed the basis of both social and economic relationships. Travelers moving between regions often noticed these shared cultural expectations. Even though dialects, foods, and local customs varied across the vast landscape of China, certain principles remained widely recognized. Respect for family, appreciation for learning, and commitment to social harmony were values that appeared again and again. Over centuries, these shared values created a strong cultural identity that stretched across enormous distances. A farmer in the south and a scholar in the north might live very different daily lives, yet both understood similar moral ideas about duty, respect, and balance. This continuity helped ancient Chinese civilization remain remarkably resilient. Empires faced wars, natural disasters, and political upheaval, yet the everyday habits of ordinary people continued to provide stability. Families still gathered for meals, children still learned from elders, and communities still cooperated to manage shared resources. And when we imagine the countless individuals who lived within this system, we begin to appreciate how much of history unfolds quietly, not in moments of dramatic change, but in the steady repetition of ordinary actions. A farmer guiding a plow through soil at sunrise, a mother preparing rice for the evening meal, a student carefully forming characters with a brush, neighbors pausing to exchange news beside a village well. These moments rarely appear in official records, yet they formed the true rhythm of ancient Chinese life. Through patience, discipline, and shared tradition, millions of people carried their civilization forward day by day, creating a cultural legacy that continues to influence the world even today. As we move toward the final reflections on ancient Chinese daily life, it becomes easier to understand how such a vast civilization could endure for thousands of years. The answer does not lie only in powerful rulers, advanced technologies, or large armies. Instead, the real strength of ancient China rested in the consistency of its social structure and the habits practiced by ordinary people every day. At the center of this structure stood the household. A household was more than a group of individuals sharing a living space. It was an organized unit of responsibility, cooperation, and tradition. Each member had a role that contributed to the stability of the whole. Elders offered guidance and experience, adults managed labor and resources, and children gradually learned the knowledge required to sustain the family in the future. Within this environment, discipline was not always enforced through strict punishment. Instead, it often developed through example and expectation. Children grew up watching how their parents treated neighbors, respected elders, and fulfilled daily duties. Over time, these observations shaped behavior naturally. A young person did not simply learn what to do, they learned why it mattered. This emphasis on moral example became one of the defining features of Chinese cultural philosophy. Confucian thought, which deeply influenced society for centuries, argued that a well-ordered society began with a well-ordered family. If families practiced respect, loyalty, and responsibility, then communities would remain peaceful and the government itself would function more effectively. In practical terms, this philosophy meant that many social problems were addressed locally before reaching higher authorities. Village elders or respected community members often helped resolve disagreements. Their role was not only to judge disputes but to restore harmony between individuals. Maintaining good relationships was considered far more valuable than winning an argument. Agriculture continued to anchor this social system. Even when cities expanded and trade networks grew more complex, the majority of the population still depended on farming. The steady production of grain supported every other part of society, from soldiers guarding distant borders to scholars studying classical texts in quiet academies. Because agriculture was so important, the success of the harvest affected the emotional atmosphere of entire communities. A good harvest brought relief, celebration, and security for the coming year. A poor harvest created anxiety and forced families to rely on stored supplies or assistance from neighbors. In some cases, communities organized shared granaries to protect against famine during difficult years. The tools used in farming were simple compared to modern machinery, yet they represented centuries of refinement. Wooden plows strengthened with iron, carefully designed irrigation channels, and organized planting methods all improved efficiency. Farmers learned how to manage soil fertility and water flow with remarkable precision, ensuring that the land could continue producing crops for generations. Meanwhile, artisans contributed their own forms of expertise to everyday life. Potters shaped clay into vessels that stored grain and water. Blacksmiths forged blades, farming tools, and household objects. Carpenters constructed houses, furniture, and bridges. Each craft required years of practice, and skilled workers were respected within their communities. Trade allowed these goods to move between regions, connecting distant parts of the empire. A merchant traveling along a river route might carry ceramics from one province, tea from another, and silk woven hundreds of miles away. These journeys gradually tied local economies into larger commercial networks. Yet even with these expanding connections, most people lived their lives within relatively small geographic areas. A villager might rarely travel beyond nearby towns. Familiar landscapes, fields, hills, rivers, and village streets formed the backdrop of daily existence. These surroundings became deeply tied to personal memory and family history. Over time, these places accumulated layers of meaning. A tree planted by a grandfather, a house built by earlier generations, or a small shrine maintained for decades became symbols of continuity. They reminded people that their lives were part of something larger than a single lifetime. Even the act of remembering ancestors strengthened this connection to the past. Through rituals and family gatherings, individuals honored those who had come before them. This remembrance encouraged humility and responsibility. People were not living only for themselves, but for the reputation and future of their family line. When historians examine ancient Chinese civilization today, they often marvel at its longevity. Few societies in human history have maintained such a continuous cultural identity across so many centuries. But when we look closely at the details of everyday life, the reasons for that continuity become clearer. It was sustained through habits of discipline, respect for tradition, cooperation between neighbors, and strong family bonds. These elements formed a stable foundation that could endure even when political leadership changed or external pressures appeared. And so, when we imagine a typical day somewhere in ancient China, morning light spreading across fields, smoke rising from cooking fires, farmers beginning their work, merchants opening market stalls, children practicing written characters, we are witnessing the quiet machinery of an entire civilization. Not dramatic, not hurried, but steady. Through millions of ordinary days like these, ancient China maintained its culture, its knowledge, and its social order for thousands of years. And in those simple routines, repeated generation after generation, the true story of ancient Chinese daily life continues to unfold.